All right, so let's continue our lectures. In the last lecture, we talked about natural laws and natural kinds and ontological categories and how we can explain what's going on in natural science and metaphysics and the relation between natural law, empirical data, objects, kinds, properties, modes, the instantiation, characterization, and everything, and dispositions, dispositional exemplification, occurrent exemplification. And we saw that we can have a very neat viewpoint that we can fit these different concepts into one ontological framework. Today, I will talk about a different language, but equivalent one that we will be using, and that's a language of power. I will get, when I get to that point, I will explain it in more detail, but just let's go back for now to what we already know about natural laws. So let's look at these four natural laws. One is that water dissolves salt, electrons attract protons, if a force is applied to a massive object, it accelerates, and mammals produce milk. These are all natural kind. This is the characterization of a natural kind with a property. Now, we can turn this into an exemplification, a dispositional exemplification, by looking at an instance of these kinds that are the subject of these sentences. So if you look at an instance of those kinds, then we will get an exemplification, a dispositional exemplification. This water dissolves water. These particular electrons attract protons, or if a force is applied to this particular massive object, it accelerates, or this specific mammal produces milk. This is the exemplification that we saw, and that's the move that we always use in those kind of common inductive argument that we had. And also note that these are all dispositions, right? So these are all in present simple case. And what we want to do is that instead of talking about this kind of diagonal, dispositional exemplification, we want to simplify things and just use a different word for it. And we use the concept of power. So when we say that this water dissolves salt, we want to use a new terminology, and we will use this to say this water has the power to dissolve salt. Just to make things easier, because otherwise we have to say that this salt is the kind is characterized, so it's dispositionally exemplifying the dissolving salt. Just make it simpler. This particular salt has the power to dissolve salt. So these are the equivalent ways that we will talk about. We're defining power now in terms of these dispositional exemplifications. These electrons attract protons. These electrons have the power to attract to attract protons. Electrons do not have power to attract salt. This massive object has the power to accelerate, and this mammal has the power to produce milk. So we call a disposition to phi the power to phi. And each power has a unique manifestation, which is so if the power to phi is the dispositional exemplification, the occurrent exemplification of that property, we would call it the manifestation of that power to phi, or phiing. So if this water dissolves salt, the manifestation of that power is that this water is solving salt. So if that water is salting, it is manifesting that power. So these electrons, if they are attracting protons, they're manifesting that power to attract. If that massive object is accelerating, then it is manifesting the power to accelerate. And if this mammal is producing, then it is manifesting the power to produce milk. So it's just a new terminology that we're defining. So we have been following a path. We said we started with objects, we talked about kinds, we talked about natural laws, we talked about dispositions, and now we're defining powers based on those dispositions. But we could have inverted this whole trajectory. We could have started with objects and put powers as a fundamental, and then define dispositions based on powers, and then define natural laws based on dispositions, and then define different kinds of things based on the natural laws. So we followed the above trajectory, but one could argue that, we could have flipped this around, right? It doesn't matter, because we have to keep one of them as fundamental and then define the rest based on it. We started with kinds of things as universals as a fundamental thing. But someone says, okay, we can also go to powers and start with powers and then define the rest based on powers. It's okay. Both ways could work. And some people argue that this second form is better, because then we wouldn't need universals as fundamental, right? Because we can just define them. We can actually get rid of the universals as an ontological category and then have only a two category ontology. We can just say we have objects, we have tropes, and objects have powers. And then from there, get the disposition, natural laws, and kinds out of it. These are two different ways of looking at it. Even though, in my opinion, the first trajectory has a better explanatory power, explanatory power. But it's just better in explaining things. But I can imagine that the bottom trajectories also can work. So today I will go through this trajectory. Of course, I wouldn't go into the whole path again, because we have been talking for a couple of sessions up to now to complete the above trajectory. I'm not going to redo everything. It's a good exercise that as I try to explain powers, you try to map this back to the above trajectory and try to translate and move between these two different perspectives. So that's why I wouldn't go into much details, but I will try to explain powers now in this kind of form, but of course defined based on dispositions. All right, so the work is based on powers of George Molnar, who believes in this kind of two category ontology. But of course, again, as we saw, to be able to explain disposition and natural laws, you either need to keep kinds as fundamental and define powers, or keep powers as fundamental and define kinds. So Molnar says that for powers we can define 5 features. One is directedness. That is, the power is always a power for something. Again, it's a very good exercise to try to translate this back to a dispositional exemplification. When we say a power is power for something, that's the power for is a power to phi. And where those phi matches, right? So the power to phi was the exemplification of that property by this particular object. But I wouldn't go through every single one of them. You just try to do that in your head. So if you have directedness, every power is a power for something. The power for the mammal has a power to produce milk as a direction. The electrons to attract protons is a power for something. We will go into more details about it. We have independence, in the sense that every power is ontologically independent of their manifestation. We have actuality, that power is more than just the possibility of manifestation. Intrinsicality, that powers are intrinsic properties of their bearers. And we also have objectivity, that powers are independent of the psychological structure of human observer. It's not about us, it's about something that's out there in the thing itself. And we'll go through 4 of them today. Objectivity we will discuss in a different lecture. So what is directedness? There are 4 criteria that we define for intentionality. Intentionality in terms of human psychology. So let's, I don't want to get into the philosophy of mind, but one of the properties of a psychological substance is that it has the power to direct its attention, for instance, towards something. So let's look at these four psychological kind, and then we will see how this can also be applied to powers. So the directness or intentionality basically means that you can direct, for instance, your attention to something. You can think about the money that you have in your drawer, or you can think about a city in a different country. You can direct your attention toward that specific thing. So an intentional property is something that can be directed towards something beyond itself. So you can think about, let's say, the money in that box. The intentional object can be existent or non-existent, which means that intention is not a relation. Like, we can think about the money in the box even though the money might not exist. So that direction, that looking at, thinking about, can exist without that thing at which we are aiming exists, which basically means that it's not a relation, because a relation needs both relata to exist. So when I say that I am a meter taller than someone else, or I'm older than someone else, that relation, that particular relation, will be a trope, and that's a particular thing that exists. If any of those items, objects, go out of existence, that relation also, that trope also goes out of existence. So the intentional object in that sense is not a relation. It's independent of that thing at which it points at. So when I think about the money in the box, it's not that there has to be money in the box for me to be able to think about it. The third option, the third property, is that the intentional object can be indeterminate in the dicto and the re sense. What do we mean by that? Let's suppose that you're focused on receiving a phone call. And then you say that, yeah, you're focused to receive a phone call very soon. You tell me that. Now, a dicto indeterminacy means that there is an indeterminacy in what you describe. So when you say that, yeah, I'm expecting a call very soon, you're not giving me exact detail. You might know it. You might know exactly at one time they're going to call you, but you just don't provide that kind of information. You just say, yeah, they're going to call me soon. But soon is indeterminate. You are waiting for something, but that thing is indeterminate. It's not that you're waiting exactly on 4 minutes from now. You're just looking at the whole time span of soon. It's just an indeterminate thing. Yeah, they're going to call me soon. That's a de dicto indeterminacy. But sometimes it can be de re, like in the sense that it's not that you know, but you just don't provide information. You just really don't know when they're going to call. So that soon is a kind of indeterminate thing. You don't know really when they're going to call. You just know that it's soon. That's all you know. So the idea here is that we can pay attention to the objects that are not crystal clear. We can think about a cat, but we don't need to have all the details worked out to be able to think about the cat. We can think about it without thinking the height, the fur, the color. So we can keep it vague and at the same time point at it. And the fourth property is that the criteria is that the intentional attributes are not truth functions and they're not extensional. What do we mean by that? Truth functions are the operators in logic that work with the truth values, in a sense that when you give them certain, for instance, propositions that are true, they work as a function, and they say, okay, if this is true and this is true, then the outcome of that function is that is true. For instance, the operator and or. These are truth functions. They're functions that if both arguments are true, the outcome is true. If one is true, the other false, the outcome is false for the and function. So the idea here is that the intention that I have is not a truth function, in a sense that if I tell you that it is true that I believe, for instance, that there is money in the box, because belief is also a prepositional attitude. It's, again, directed toward the existence of money in that box. If I tell you that, hey, like I'm thinking about the money in the box, like that's true, or I believe that there is money in the box, it's not a truth function in a sense that if we know that this is true, we cannot conclude that there is money in the box. In the same sense that if I tell you proposition A and proposition B, the and of them is true, you can conclude then A and B both are true. You can get something out of it. But here, if I tell you that, yeah, I'm thinking about the money in the box, you cannot get any truth value out of that about the existence of money in the box. And they're not extensional in a sense that sometimes we have two different terms that they are co-extensional in the sense that they have the same extension. They denote the same thing, but connotation is different. And it seems that our intensional attributes are not extensional. Let me give you an example. If I tell you that there is salt in the food, and let's suppose that that's a true proposition. Like I tell you there's salt in the food. If we make a new proposition and then we say there is sodium chloride in the food. Now, if the first proposition is true that there is common salt, and we know that common salt is sodium chloride, then if the first one is true, then the second one is also true. Because both of those terms, we're assuming that they're denoting the same thing. So if their extension is the same thing, if one of them is true, then the other one will also be true. But the intentional attributes are not like that. If I believe that there is, like imagine that you tell someone that, hey, like I'm putting salt in the food. And they're like, okay, yeah, I believe you put salt in the food. But if you tell them that, hey, I put sodium chloride in the food. I was like, no, you didn't. If they don't know that the salt is the sodium chloride, if they don't believe that, then they wouldn't believe that. So they might think that there is salt. So they will direct their attention toward the food and they will say, yeah, I agree that there is salt in the food, but I do not agree that there is sodium chloride in the food. You see, so the truth of one does not mean the truth of the other one, even though the extension-wise they are identical to each other. So these are different criteria that we can check for intentionality in the kind of psychological sense. And Molnar claims that we can say the same thing about powers. It's not just for the mental capacity to have this kind of direction. For instance, powers are directed towards their manifestation. If you have a glass that is fragile, then it's directed towards breaking. That's what we mean by fragile. If we have salt, that it has the power to be to dissolve in water, then as we said, it's always a power to do something. It's directed toward some specific effect. It doesn't have to be something psychological. That's something that people usually confuse with, because this is related to teleology in Aristotelian metaphysics, and it doesn't mean that there is a mind going on and is focusing on something. It just means that it can be completely natural inclination toward a specific thing. And here we're talking about powers directed toward their manifestation. The intentional object can be existence or non-existence is the same thing. Something can be fragile without ever breaking. So the breaking of the glass may never exist, yet the power of the glass to be fragile, to break easily, that's a direction that it can have. So in the same sense, it's not a relation, it's just a direction. They can be indeterminate in a sense that many factors in the manifestation of a power can be skipped. Like we can talk about the breaking of that glass in a kind of vague term. We don't specify exactly how it's going to break. We just talk about it like just breaking, or it's going to break soon. We can we can define a power in a sense that it's going to be vague, but it can also be a kind of de re indeterminate in a sense. For instance, we have the radium decay of atoms. It's indeterminate in a sense. It has the power to decay, but it's de re indeterminate. Like, we just don't know when it's going to happen. We know that if we have like a amount of them after halftime, half of them have been decayed. But if you have one single one, there's a probability of it, but we don't know when exactly. That's in the array indeterminate. And in the same sense, truth functions, they're not truth functions, and they're not also extensional. Examples. So if we say that the clouds have the power to break the drought, this has nothing to do with the truth of the actual breaking. So the land is dry, and then you say that the clouds in the sky, they have the power to remove that drought. But that doesn't mean that it will actually happen. Just because that's true does not mean that the other thing is true. And there's also they're not extensional, in the same sense that if I tell you that this specific material has the power to turn this paper into red, does not mean that this material has the power to turn this paper into the color of the traffic lights that causes people to stop. Even though they might be coextensional in the sense that they're both red. But the power into one is not the same of the power to the other. It does have the power to cause it to turn red, but it doesn't have the power to turn it into the color of the light that causes people to stop. So in that sense, we can see that it satisfies the power, it satisfies the four criteria of intentionality. And also notice that as I'm doing this, as I'm trying to defend powers, I'm basically reinventing the wheel, because I did sort of this kind of defense for the kinds and everything else, and now we're doing it again. So it's just again a good exercise that we trying to really make sure that what we have here in this path is it's very close to what we want. The second one is the independence part. So the independence says that the power is independent of the manifestation, in the sense that it's directed towards something. If that thing doesn't exist, the power can still exist. Now that's confusing for some people. Like, how can we talk about a glass being fragile if we have never seen it break, or we will never see it break? How can we really talk about it? So people usually try to explain powers in terms of conditionals, a conditional relation, because they say, okay, it's not because the claim is that it's not a relation, but people will say, no, you're wrong. It's a relation, but it's a conditional one. So we'll look at a couple of alternatives trying to explain powers. One of them is the naive conditional analysis. That says that when something is disposed at time t to give response r, that is when it has the power to r, to a stimulus s, so this conditional analysis says this. It says when we say that x is disposed at time t to give response r to stimulus s, when we say that, when we talk about powers in that sense, what we mean basically, if that's the case, if and only if x were to undergo stimulus s at time t, then x would give response r. So it's like, okay, look, when you say that this glass is fragile, what you really mean is that if you knock it, if you kick it, then it would break. That's what you mean. And in that case, it is a relation, right? Because you always have to have that response to be able to say that that thing has that power. So they say, no, it's a relation, but it's a conditional one. But this analysis has a couple of problems. One is that it removes intrinsicality. Why is that? Because it seems that there doesn't have to be anything about that specific statue to be, that glass statue, to be fragile. There's nothing about it being made of glass or being so thin that makes it fragile. Why? Because imagine that you have a statue. I'm not telling you how it's made, from what it's made. And let's suppose we hit it with something. And the moment that we hit it with that thing, God makes that statue to break. Every time. You have a statue, you knock it, it breaks. God breaks it. Then by this definition, we should say that that thing is fragile. If by fragile we mean, just knocking on it. But I haven't told you what that statue is made of. So even if it's made of steel, but every time that we touch it, God makes it to shatter. We have to say that that statue is made of steel, but it's fragile, which doesn't make sense. It has to be, what we feel like is that no, the statue is still is not fragile, it's made of steel. It's just that God is so powerful that it can even shatter the statue, but it's not fragile. The other problem with this explanation is that not all powers have a stimulus, because this definition assumes that everything is disposed only when there is a stimulus S that gives response R, that causes that X to response R. But that's not always the case, like the radium decay. Like, what's the stimulus? It has the power to decay, but when it does, what's the stimulus? There's no S. So not all powers have a stimulus. Or, for instance, the gravitational attraction between two massive bodies. It's not like that something is stimulating them all the time. Like, there's nothing stimulating them. But they just constantly are manifesting the power that they have. That's the power of attraction. The other problem is with this analysis is thinkishness. C.B. Martin talks about this. I guess C.B. Martin, if not Molnar. So what is thinkishness? Now we'll talk about powers in more detail in the next session. And there are powers where we can... certain entities have powers, but some have powers to gain some other powers. For instance, imagine you have a piece of metal, you wrap some wire around it, and you run some electricity through that wire. What happens is that a magnetic field is created, causing that iron to become a temporary magnet. And that magnet now attracts metals. So what we have there is a second order power, in the sense that you have a rod that has the power to become magnetized. And if that power is manifested, that metal now has the power to attract metals and if that's manifested, you see metals attracted to that metal rod. So that's a second order power. Now, thinkishness, it says, suppose that you have that rod and you have that wire and you run the electricity, and at that moment something's attracted. So let's apply this analysis. We have something X, that's metal, and we are saying at time t, let's suppose at time t, and the stimulus is clicking the current. So if I close a switch, that's the stimulus S, and the response R is attraction of metal particles to that rod. The analysis says that we should say that if and only if X would give that response if that stimulus has happened. So if I close the switch and the metals are attracted to the metal rod, what we're supposed to say is that the metal rod has the power to attract those particles, those metal particles. Or in other words, that rod is a magnet. But you see, the problem is that the rod is not a magnet. It's just a normal rod. When you close the switch, the current goes, that creates that second order power, and that's the power that attracts it. But based on this definition, we have to say that that metal rod has the power to attract metal rods, to attract metal particles, but that's not true. It doesn't have that power yet. The other way around is if you have a live wire, so electricity goes through it, it's a very powerful line, so it's very dangerous to touch. But you have a security circuit somewhere. So if you touch that wire, if that security switch is not there, you would die. But if it is there, it will cut off the power. So you would be fine. Now, based on this analysis, if you have something and the stimulus is me touching that wire and the response is not dying or not getting hurt or not getting electrocuted. But based on this definition, what we should conclude is that that wire does not have power to electrocute me. Why? Because if at time t I touch that wire, nothing happens. Then based on this definition, we should say that the wire does not have that power to electrocute me, which is false. Another analysis can be causal conditional analysis. That's when, so basically some people said that, okay, this intrinsicality that is lacking in the naive causal analysis, we should bring that in. It's not that we just hit the statue or the glass and it breaks. It's because there's something in the structure of that glass, something about the structure of the molecules of that statue that when you hit it, it causes it to break. So they give a causal analysis in the sense that X has some property that would cause X to give response R if X were to undergo stimulus S. So if you add S and B together, they're sufficient to give a response R. Now this has two problems from the other one. The naive one is that not all powers have a stimulus. Thinkishness is still there because that wouldn't change. You can reapply the whole argument there. But it also adds two more problems. One is deviant chains of causality, because in causality, the process is not really important. The chain is not really important. So A can cause B, B can cause C, C can cause D, and we can claim that now A is causing D because of that transitivity. And that can cause a problem because let's suppose that I have a statue again, and the moment that I hit it, there are these powerful rays of some light that is shed on that statue, and because of that powerful X-ray or Z-ray, some call it Z-rays, I guess. Stephen Martin again. The moment that you touch the statue, the Z-rays are shed on that statue and it breaks apart. Now in that case, it is my touching that causes the rays to go through that statue and cause it to shatter, which basically means that it's my knocking that causes this statue to break apart. And based on this definition, we should say that statue is fragile even if it's made out of steel. But again, that's not the case. And also masking is not possible because this analysis says that B plus S are sufficient to cause that reaction. But they might not be sufficient because if I tell you that I have a live wire there and I'm going to touch it, then you will say, okay, then if it has the power to electrocute you, then it means that if you touch it, then it will electrocute you. But the point is that it will not electrocute me because of that masking, because of that security switch that's happening there. Can you see what's happening on the other side, on the dispositions? We talked about this before, that dispositions can block each other. This is the other side of the coin in terms of powers. There's megaric actualism in the time of Aristotle. There's also this kind of talk of powers, and there were some group, it seems, of megaric school who had a very interesting view on powers. I'm getting a little bit tired, maybe because I'm trying to basically redo everything that I've been doing in the last 4 sessions into one simple session. So this quote is from megaric school of the time of Aristotle, and this quote is from Metaphysics of Aristotle. So Aristotle says that there are some who says, as the megaric school does, that a thing can act, and by can he means that the power to act, only when it is acting, and when it is not acting, it cannot act. So there were this school that they said, okay, like power is something that you only have when you do that thing that you have the power to do. So only when you're manifesting something, that's when you have the power to do. For instance, Aristotle says that he who is not building cannot build, but only he who is building when he is building, and so in all other cases. So they said it's only when you're building we can say, hey, you have the power to build. But if you're not building actually right now, then you don't have the power to build. But Aristotle goes and explains that this has a couple of problems. One is learning and losing the skills. Like imagine that you learn to play the violin. Now, based on magnetic actualism, after you spend years to learning to play violin, and while you're playing the violin, they say, oh, you know how to play violin. You have the power to play the violin. But now suppose that you put that aside. You stop playing violin. And then you pick it up again to play it. The idea is that based on magnetic actualism, the moment that you're not actually playing violin, you lose all the power to play violin. But then when you hold it up for the second time to start playing again, you again gain all the powers that you had before. And Aristotle says that this is weird. Why is it that the first time I spent years to gain that power to play violin, but then now I just pick it up and immediately I have all the power again coming back to me? It also has a problem between distinguishing between being asleep and being blind, because based on them, both of them are not seeing, so they don't have the power of sight. But we say, okay, if someone is asleep, they still have the power of sight, it's just not manifesting. But someone who's blind, they just don't have the power of sight. The other one is actuality. Some might think that having powers just means that manifestation is possible. Another definition of power. People might say that at time t, x has power to phi if and only if it is possible that x phis at t. We're just talking about possibilities. When we say that the statue is fragile, we're just talking about it is possible that it breaks. Now, what's the problem with this kind of view is that the possibility there is not clear what kind of possibility it is. If we're talking about metaphysical possibility, then we will get to weird conclusions, because it's metaphysically possible that the air that I'm breathing is toxic or becomes toxic. Is metaphysically possible that the wire that I'm just touching, has some current going through it. It's metaphysically possible that the statue that I have that's made of steel to break apart. Metaphysically, of course, there are a lot of things that can be possible, but we won't attach powers to those things. And if we want to talk about a kind of relative possibility, in the sense that, okay, let's fix these things and then see what else is possible, then in that case, we would also get some strange conclusions. And I'm trying to my mind doesn't work anymore. Relative possibility that when we fix something, and then we say that, okay, if I fix that, I will still have the power. So let's suppose that go back to that statue, and let's suppose that we put this constraint that no one touches that statue with anything. But if we put that kind of possibility, if that kind of condition on it, then relative to that condition, it will never break. It's not possible for it to break. If we put it and isolate it in a sense that nothing will touch it, then it will never break. And by this definition, we should say that statue, if we are putting it in a very isolated place, it is not fragile anymore, which doesn't make any sense, because we put things in isolation, we try to protect them, we wrap them around in different stuff because they are fragile. We tell people, hey, not to touch it because they're fragile. But based on this definition, if we make sure that no one touches it, then it stops being fragile, which doesn't make sense. There's also intrinsicality, that the powers are intrinsic to that thing itself. Now, Molnar here concludes that they're not really good arguments for this to defend this thesis, that whether powers are intrinsic, something related to that thing itself, or extrinsic in a sense that something else is giving it its power. And I guess this is one of the weak points of powers, because the other trajectory that we had based on kinds, it has intrinsicality built into it, because remember, powers were the dispositional exemplification of things. But that was only possible when you had one particular thing of a particular kind that is characterized by some property. So the intrinsicality of that thing comes from the fact that we're talking about different kinds of things. So a glass is this specific piece of glass is fragile because it's this kind of thing. The salt is water soluble because it's this kind of thing. And there we have this intrinsicality, because we're just talking about what kind of thing this thing is. But Molnar believes that it's not really, we cannot really defend it, so he just leaves it at there. Next lecture, we will look into objectivity of powers, and from there we will basically complete this both different ways of looking at the same thing, either starting from kinds, ending in powers, or starting from powers and ending in kinds.